All right. Well, I think we've now gotten pretty much everybody in here. So let's see if I can change my view. Okay. All right. Hi, guys. Welcome to our
Hi,
event.
Joanne.
So glad you guys are here. We are live streaming this onto YouTube. So if we have any newcomers, I just ask that you please turn off your cameras so that way we make sure all of the streaming works out totally fine. Yeah, and if you have any questions throughout the event, feel free to pop them into the chat, either on YouTube or on Zoom. I'll be monitoring both. I would just want to introduce myself. I'm Tavy Juarez. I'm the Vice President of the International Center for Women Playwrights. I'm so happy you guys came and joined us for this event. Just a couple things about us and who we are and what we do. We're the International Center for Women Playwrights. We do events like this. I opened this up to all of social media and the public, so I don't expect everybody here to know who we are, but our mission and our vision is to connect, inspire, and empower women playwrights to achieve equality on the world stages. And I encourage you to please come and join us if you are a woman playwright. We have opportunities, we share opportunities, we have script feedback groups, and we have circles where we all connect and engage with one another. You can find out more about us at www.womenplaywrights.org. And if you have any questions, feel free to just let me know. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. So I'm going to pass this event along to Cindy, who's going to lead us through this discussion. And then at the end, if you guys have questions that pop up during this, please feel free to put them into the chat, and then we'll field them at the end. We'll have a moment for questions and stuff. So yeah, that's it. Cindy, I'll send it over to you.
Okay, so for Joanne, you think you could turn off your video? Turn off your video. So anyhow, I'm Cindy Cooper. I'm a playwright, and okay, no problem. And I want to introduce Alexis Green. Hello, Alexis, Green. And Alexis is the author of this marvelous book, Emily Mann, Rebel Artist of the American Theater. And so it is about Emily Mann, who is a playwright, a director, and was the artistic director up until about a year ago of the McCarter, which is one of the largest regional theaters. But I really wanted to talk about Emily Mann as a playwright. And so that's what I've invited Alexis to do here. And we're going to really kind of hone in and focus on maybe 4 plays that she wrote. And I'll just say what I liked about the book is, and going behind the scenes of these plays, is that as playwrights, we're so isolated. Generally, we're not in other people's productions, so we don't know if, like, the producer yells at you, or if they've asked you to rewrite something 5 times, or if everything is just hunky-dory and there's only parties. So being inside the experience of another playwright was really fascinating to me. And then the other thing is, because Alexis is a critic, a observer, a cultural observer, and has an ability to bring big picture things to theater. She's written 8 books about theater, including a biography of Lucille Lortel and several others. She's able to bring a perspective to the topic that a lot of contemporary books about contemporaries can't do or don't do, because it's a subject speaking, and they don't really have the objectivity. And so let me first dive in. Alexis, what is it that made you want to write this book?
Thank you, Cindy. And first of all, thank you to the International Center and, for making this happen tonight. It's terrific. So what made me want to do this? I'd written, as you said, a biography of Lucille Ortel, which was published back in 2004. Lucille was an off-Broadway producer, among other things. And really the focus of that book was on the off-Broadway movement and its evolution. And I wanted to write another biography, and I wanted it to really be about a person as well as a person's art. I wanted it to be about a woman. I wanted it to be about a woman's art, and also relate that playwriting art to the times in which the woman was writing. And I had known Emily Mann at least since 1983, and we had become friendly. And around 2014, I sent her a LinkedIn message and I said, hey, what would you think about my writing a biography of you? And she wrote back immediately, sure, that would be great.
Good use of LinkedIn. Good to know. So I really want to talk to you about 4 plays, and this is kind of chronological, but I think they all presented different issues, and from a playwriting perspective. So they are Still Life, then Execution of Justice, Having Our Say, and then Gloria, a Life. I think that's the title. So let's just start with Still Life. That 1978, Emily Mann wrote this. And each of these is a chapter in your book, or some of them are 2. And that's a story of a Marine who's returned from Vietnam. They had some horrific experiences there. And it's paired with the stories of his wife and his lover. And I picked up one line from the chapter you wrote. You said, that the second reading, which was in Minneapolis at the Guthrie, or in Minneapolis, somebody in the audience said the play blew everyone's minds. I called the producer, and in the middle of the night, and said, you have to do this. And, and Emily Mann is known for theater of testimony. Almost all of her work, or at least all of these pieces, are about real life people and real life circumstances. So how did she get into doing Still Life? What makes it unique? What was the experience like?
Well, just to backtrack a little bit, and that's a great introduction to it. She had been sort of what we would call today an intern, an apprentice at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. And she had written a play called Nuala Allen, the autobiography of a survivor, which was produced there in their second stage in 1977. And it was essentially a monologue. Drawn from Emily's and a friend's interviews with this woman in England. She was a Holocaust survivor. And so when Emily was introduced to the Vietnam vet and interviewed him and his wife and his lover, she formed it as 3 monologues initially. And there was a reading at the Guthrie of the play in its early draft. And her then boyfriend, Jerry Famine, talked with her after the reading and said, it would really be a much more dynamic play if you could intercut these monologues, break them up, interweave the lines, so that even though these 3 people are not talking to each other directly, there does seem to be dialogue. And so what Emily told me essentially is that through this play, she found the form of playwriting that she had stayed with throughout. It became the form for theater of testimony because these 3 people are giving testimonials essentially about their lives, their thoughts, their problems. But she's arranged cut the monologues, the original monologues, so that they do seem to be dialogue, and there is conflict, and there is theatricality. And this is a form that she has stayed with throughout her playwriting career. In addition, the play touches really for the first, well, very significantly for the first time on themes that she would continue to touch upon. Violence in the world beyond these three people, the violence of war, domestic violence, because the Vietnam vet comes home and he beats his wife, he abuses her. And so that is one theme that is paramount in this play. And it's also a feminist play, except that here the feminist is really, as I say in the biography, the feminist is Emily Mann raising a red flag because these two women are still under the control of this Vietnam vet in one way.
I thought that was a really interesting observation you had in there, that they were so focused on healing him or helping him or making him happy. And I took something from the book. It says, there's no single definition of a feminist play. However, if one criterion is to portray women's marginalization within and subsequent resistance to a society where men dominate in public and private realms, still life qualifies. But the resistance is Mann's in the form of what could be considered a red alert.
Yes, I agree with that. I agree with what I wrote.
Okay.
And of course, the other element that of her playwriting, if you will, that was significant here, as it had been with Anula Allen play that came before this, is that she directed all three productions of this play. She directed the first production in Chicago at the Goodman Theater. She directed the New York production at the Women's Project, which was at the Women's Project, and then she directed a production in California. She has always tried to direct the first productions of her plays.
So I know that's a question we were going to ask later, but how do you think that being a director affects or influences her playwriting? And a lot of times playwrights are told they can't direct, or they're not encouraged to direct, particularly their own work. So how did she get away with that?
Well, she's always been a very determined individual. She didn't always get away with it, as we'll talk to some degree as we go along here. But she liked to direct her own plays because she would work with the actors, and in workshops or rehearsals, she would end up doing rewrites, and the rewrites were often helped along by what the actors discovered in the workshop or in the rehearsal. And so it's sort of they were conducive to each other, directing and writing the play.
I want to move on to Execution of Justice, but you tell one story about in one rehearsal, the actress wanted to be blindfolded.
Oh, yes. That was Mary McDonnell. Well, there was the discussion. The set ended up being simply a table with these three people, the two women and the Vietnam vet behind the table. And the only decor, if you will, is a screen behind the table, because the Vietnam vet is now a photographer and he will show slides of some of his photographs. And one of the questions that arose was, well, since these people aren't exactly talking directly to each other, are they hearing each other? This was almost an actor question, if you will. And so during one rehearsal, I believe it was Mary McDonnell who played the veteran's wife, and she, made sure that she couldn't hear anybody, and she just explored how that felt.
Okay, so let's go on to execution, because we're gonna fly here, because we're gonna stay for 40 or 45 minutes total. And so execution of justice, that began as a project in 1978 to 1984, and then you have 2 chapters about that. Another time period, and that was originally called the Dan White story. So, just a reminder for people, that's Dan White was the man who shot and killed Mayor George Moscone and the gay supervisor Harvey Milk in San Francisco. He was tried, and he famously raised a Twinkie defense that he'd had too much sugar. And the jury somewhat bought it, in the sense that they didn't convict him of the most serious charges. They convicted him of lesser charges, manslaughter instead of murder. And she was commissioned by the Eureka in San Francisco. And I believe they delivered her the transcript, like that was what she was supposed to write.
Yeah.
So what happened from there?
So the Eureka commissioned Emily in 1982, and yes, they dumped this enormous trial transcript in her lap, so to speak, and she soon decided that the play did have to be a trial play, and she also knew that she wanted video and film, and to make it a little bit more traditionally documentary in style. And the story of how execution of justice ended up being produced, where it was produced, is, one of these not very happy stories in some respects, in terms of what can happen in the theater when you have to negotiate with other directors and maybe even producers, and do not necessarily know what they're doing. At any event,
why wasn't it why do you say that? I know she didn't direct this one initially, but why do you say it wasn't a happy story?
Well, maybe that's the wrong choice of words. It was a challenging series of events. Let me put it that way. That's probably a better way to put it. She was commissioned by the Eureka, and she wrote a draft, which was about 6 hours long. It was 3 acts, and it took about 6 hours to read. And the Eureka didn't have a theater, and they didn't have enough money to produce it anyplace else, so they couldn't produce it. And Emily took it to the Actors Theater of Louisville, and they produced it in 1984 with the 2 men who ran Eureka directing it, Oscar Eustis and Tony Tacone.
And I noticed in your book, you said there were 9 plays that season, and this was the only one by a woman.
That's right. This was the only one by a woman at the Humanities Festival in this March of 1984. And you get the feeling pretty early on, or I got the feeling from talking with Emily and also doing research, that she had always wanted to direct it. She said she liked the production at ATL, but she had other ideas. But in the meantime, where was this play going to go after it was performed at ATL, where, by the way, it got excellent reviews, even though most of the reviewers said it needed still to be cut somewhat. And so then the first real significant regional production happened at Arena Stage in 1985, in the spring of 1985, with Doug Wager directing. And he brought in all, film and television clips and, you know, made it a tech event, essentially, as well as the stage, you know, production.
So that didn't come from her, that came from the director.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting point. She had called for it in her original script, but it had hardly existed at ATL in that first production, and Wager really brought it forth and used it, you know, excellently, according to all of the reviews from DC and even farther out in the country. And by this time, she'd also managed to cull the script down to 2 acts. So it was considerably shorter than it had been previously. But she still wanted to direct it. And so she invited Mark Bly from the Guthrie Theater, who was the dramaturg there at the time, to come see the DC production. And he didn't think it was quite as great as everybody else did. And at any event, she was invited to direct a production at the Guthrie in the fall of 1985, November 1985. Meanwhile, the play acquires 2 commercial producers who offer Doug Wager the chance to direct it on Broadway, and Doug Wager accepts. But Emily, at some point during the fall of 1985, when she's directing at the Guthrie, she decides that she wants to direct the Broadway production. And after all, it's her play. And so at some point, somebody calls up Doug Wager and says, sorry, so sorry, but you're not going to be doing this. And it was the kind I describe in the book, that it's the kind of, you know, behind the scenes showbiz rumpus that doesn't leave anybody looking very swell, you know, including Emily. One of the interesting things that happened with the play in November at the Guthrie was that Dan White committed suicide in San Francisco. He had been let out of prison a little early. He moved to Los Angeles, and then he tried to move back in with his wife, who's still living in San Francisco. But one day he got into his car and he rolled up the windows and turned on the gas and killed himself. And so Emily had to write a new ending, so to speak. How was she going to incorporate this? And she wrote one line toward about 9 lines from the end of the script about how, you know, Dan White on such and such a day turned on the fumes in his car and committed suicide.
And I want to point out, she started out with the transcript, but quickly realized that it wasn't going to be contained by the transcript. It didn't tell enough of the societal influences. And so she added what was happening, was this the chorus of uncalled witnesses.
Yes, thank you for reminding me about bringing that up. She considered that the most significant change that she made to her script, that before she included a chorus of uncalled witnesses, the script had focused a little too much, perhaps, on the trial of Dan White, and without the voices of other people who lived in San Francisco at the time. In one case, a cop, another case, a drag queen, the DA, whose career was ruined by the fact that he lost the case, essentially. And so, again, you have that form of testimony / documentary play that is so so much hers, which is that you cut back and forth to different voices, and she manages to make it a very theatrical experience as these voices contrast and collide.
Right. I mean, that's one thing that she is, I think, particularly adept at, is writing about events, real life events that people know about, but bringing some other influences into it that kind of give people an opportunity to see it in a slightly different way than they had before they came into the theater.
I think it's the strongest play that she's written to date, among other things, because it gives not only a picture of a trial and a man on trial and a portrait of people in San Francisco at the time, but it allows us to see an American world in which, unfortunately, many people fear and hate the other, quote unquote. And, that is as unfortunately as alive today as it was in 1984 when she began writing the play.
Right. And one thing you write is, so it's a trial of values. The trial is a metaphor for a city on trial, country, and the times. So it's like she took this one event, I mean, in your view, took this one event and kind of like expanded the scope of it.
Yes. I think she did that very consciously. That was a note, she keeps diaries and little notebooks that she writes notes into herself as she directs and as she writes plays. And that was a note to herself.
Which is a good point to add in at this point. You had access to all her materials, and you also interviewed a few people?
I interviewed nearly 100 people, yes. And yeah. I did, I had access to all her files, her diaries.
And you went through like multiple drafts of plays and
multiple drafts of plays. I went to the university. I traveled around the country. I went to the University of Chicago, where her father's papers are, and looked through those. And I don't know if we have the time to go into this, and made a wonderful discovery. I discovered the audio tape of the first play she actually wrote, which has never been produced, which she wrote when she was at Radcliffe.
Oh, wow. Cool. Well, I think just wrapping up on Execution of Justice, because I do want to talk about these two other plays. You have a line that really struck me. This is a quote from somebody. This is when she kind of insisted on directing on Broadway. And he said, you have to be courageous. You have to be courageous with Emily. You have to be as courageous as she is. And I thought that was like kind of remarkable that she.
Yes, I mean, it's, the play did go to Broadway. And unfortunately, in 1986, it had 8 previews and 12 performances. It was, in a proscenium stage. It did not perhaps have the kind of environment, kind of raw environment that it had either at the Arena Stage or at the Guthrie. And critics apparently were not turned on. But
it's still being produced.
Oh yeah, definitely, it's still being produced. I mean, critics are not always right.
Do you think she made a mistake directing it?
Well, as as I write in the there were different views about that. Some people thought that Doug Wager should have been allowed to direct it on Broadway. And others said, you know, a playwright should not direct their own work, to which Emily's response was the chutzpah of that woman. And, you know, I think directing on Broadway for a first attempt, it's going to be tough, and it was. And the second time around, as we launched,
having our say,
it was a lot better.
So having her say was her second Broadway production, right? And this, for just to remind people, this is based on a book, Having Our Say by what's her name?
Amy Hill Hearth.
Amy Hill Hearth with Annie Delaney and Sarah Delaney, and it's about their lives, the lives of two African American women who were remarkable on their own, but had a very long life. One was a second African American dentist, and the other was the first to teach home ec, African American teach home ec in New York City. They were sisters. They were unmarried. They lived very full and rich lives, and the book kind of caught fire. And so Emily started to make an adaptation of this, and that was kind of also a little bit different from the other two pieces.
Well, this raises an interesting topic, and I would love to hear what some of or read what some of the viewers think about it. I asked Emily at one point, you know, what did she feel about this word adaptation? Because it's used, you know, it's thrown around all over the place, and you know, she doesn't like it, and I don't blame her, because she thinks it undercuts, slightly denigrates the imagination of and the creativity of the playwright who has been inspired by another work, you know, has been inspired by a book or a play to transform that into something else. So
the play inspired by.
The play inspired by. And
she talk a little bit about, she went out to met them, and that sort of changed how she approached the production, right?
Well,
or her concept, I guess.
Remember which came first. I mean, just to fill in a couple of gaps here, by 1995, when she wrote this and it was produced and directed it first at the McCarter, she had become head of the McCarter Theater Center in Princeton. In the years after Execution of Justice, she and Jerry Baman, whom she had married, were divorced. They'd had a baby. And so she was a single mom. And she felt that she needed a more stable role, a stable environment, in order to be able to do what she wanted to do, which was direct and write plays, and also raise her son in a stable environment.
Right.
So she had applied for the position of artistic director at the McCarter, and they hired her. She was the first woman to be hired to run that theater. And she fell in love with the book, and interestingly, so did Camille Cosby and Judy Jameson, and they gave enhancement money to the McCarter to produce it, and were also, you know, planning to take it to Broadway. They had envisioned a cast of, you know, 10 or more, but the history, oral history, if you will, that the two sisters wrote with Amy Hill Hearth is about two sisters, and Emily wanted to keep it that way. She thought it would be a tour de force for two actors, and I think she was absolutely right. I mean, and this is definitely a feminist play. I mean, these women are rebels. You know, they're independent. They have jobs that hardly anybody before them ever had, who happen to be Black Americans. They don't particularly care for white Americans, and they are somewhat sly about that, but it's there. and and they both decided to be independent and never get married.
And she tells a story. She tells a story, though, to the audience as if they're at the house of the two women, and it's kind of a dinner party. It's kind of like
it's a birthday party, or sort of a celebration for the women's late father.
And the audience is kind of like invited in, I guess.
Yes, right. Yeah.
And there were some other, and as I understand it from your book, that came from her visiting them and interviewing them personally. And that's when she came up with the idea to make it this party where people could experience what she experienced as an interviewer.
And what she had also, yes, in other words, the audience is invited to partake of this birthday celebration, if you will, and which also involves cooking and making food, and it reminded Emily to a great extent of experiences she had had when she was a child, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen and watching her put together supper, and that some of the greatest conversations that you'd ever experienced happened when you were sitting in a kitchen, as a kid, and talking with your grandmother or your parents.
Yeah. So Tavy's reminding me in the chat that there are questions coming in, so I want to just speed up a little bit, but talk about some of the personal challenges she had at this time.
And the one very significant personal challenge was that she had been, about a year or so before she directed this, she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And frequently at the end of a rehearsal at the McCarter and even on Broadway, the play was staged at the Booth Theater. She had to be carried out of the theater. What do you mean
carried out? What do you mean carried out?
Carried out. I mean, two people or one person had to actually. She couldn't walk.
Wow.
And so somebody had to lift her up and carry her to her car, drive her home, and then carry her from her car, into her house at night after rehearsal.
Was that severe?
So, on the one hand, she loved directing this play, although there was considerable rivalry between the two actors who were playing Bessie and Sadie. But it was also, a painful experience. And one of the better things that came out of it was that after the Broadway production opened, she was reviewed very positively, as a very good contrast to what happened with Execution. She gave an interview to Mel Gusso and went very public with the fact that she was suffering from multiple sclerosis.
Okay, I was going to say that was not well known.
Yeah.
So just briefly, even though it's like my favorite chapter, Gloria, Our Life.
Why is it your favorite?
Because the roller coaster that was happening to get this play together, I thought was amazing. But it started with Kathy Najimy and some of the people approached Gloria Steinem. That the play is about Gloria Steinem and the movement for women's liberation. And I think you have a line that says, Mann was walking on the Princeton campus where McCarter is one day when Kathy Najimy called her, how would you like to write a play about Gloria? And Mann's telling it took her about 2 seconds to say yes. And it took about 6 years, I think, to get it mounted.
I don't know if it took that long, but it was not quick. Well, okay, to try to summarize as quickly as possible. It started out as to be a one-woman piece for Gloria Steinem to perform by herself at Lincoln Center Theater. And there was one reading for an invited audience, which miraculously I attended, where Gloria actually did read the script. But Gloria Steinem decided that she really couldn't, she was not up for that. She really couldn't do that. She was not somebody who could perform, even if it was, once every week. This was just not in her vocabulary, so to speak. And so ultimately, a new director was hired, Diane Paulus, and Paulus, during rehearsals, essentially took the script and took the descriptions of Gloria's memories and the imagery and divided them up into scenes, brought in other actors so that there was a large cast instead of just Gloria. And Paulus really made it into an event. And Lincoln Center Theater was no longer involved. Daryl Roth was the sole producer, and she produced it at her theater near Union Square in Manhattan. And it was an event. And there was an act 2, which was a talking circle, which is something that always appealed to Steinem in her study and work with Native Americans. And in this the talking circle at Daryl Roth's theater, mostly women attended, and there was a lot of discussion about what women should do to progress in the world. The production coincided with the hashtag Me Too movement. And so there were a number of, every night there were people in the audience who described harassment or assault, difficult situations that they had encountered. And just as one last point dealing with this play, this was also writing this became a climactic moment in Emily's personal life, because at a TCG conference, I believe in 2018, Theater Communications Group brought everybody into a room who wanted to talk about whether or not they had been sexually assaulted or harassed in some way during their careers. And Emily broke down in sobs. She really couldn't even walk out of the room because it brought to the fore an experience she'd had when she was a teenager and had gone to Europe for a trip during one summer before college and had been raped. And so it's in the book, it's a climactic moment in Emily's life, and it's also a climactic moment in her writing life.
Right. And it became, from a playwright's perspective, where it started and where it ended were two completely different places. Not completely different, but different places.
Oh, I think they are really completely different, yes.
Well, they both have Gloria Steinem involved somewhere. But there are some questions. So Tavi's telling me I have to move on. And let's see, one of the questions is, well, somebody commented that they saw, they took a class with Emily Mann and that she exhibited no signs of MS. So that was good.
It's definitely in remission. That's definitely, yes.
Okay. And somebody asked, what is happening? What is she doing now?
She is working.
Other than promoting your book.
She's been very, very generous on that score, yes. She has been a producer asked her to quote unquote adapt that word again, the pianist, the memoir, The Pianist,
Okay.
for the stage. And so inspired by that, she has written a play based on his experience. I can never pronounce his name, I'm sorry. And she's actually directing a workshop of that. She'll be directing a workshop of that in June. And the aim is to take it to Broadway. And she's working on a musical as well.
Okay. Now, are there, I have some other questions that have to do about, you know, why, and I don't know if I'm missing anything, Davy, you know, why you think she has been successful, or whether it's a personality thing, or, you know, why, you know, what has made her be able to thrive in this entirely difficult environment that's mostly male dominated, or was for most of her career. But if there's something else, you know, that I've skipped that you want to say, just pop that in now.
I think it's a part of her personality. She's never accepted the status quo. She has always moved forward. If somebody says no to her, she will ask again and again, you know, until they either say yes, or she moves on, you know, in another direction, in a new environment. Determination. And although she might not describe it as self-confidence, I believe that there's definitely an internal value of self and of herself's artistry that helps her to keep going forward. I mean, it is an incredibly difficult arena for women. And even though it is, you know, it's improving, it improves slowly.
So I have some other questions here. A couple relate to identity, the identity politics in theater now. You know, for example, having our say, she's a white woman, she's writing about two Black women. I think the book author was white as well. But, you know, was this an issue? And, you know, how has she evolved on this? Or, you know, I mean, not evolved, but, you know, has her thinking changed, as some people have? I mean, is it seen as cultural appropriation? That's one question. How does she feel about all the cultural appropriation rules? I don't know if they're rules, but, you know, questions happening now.
Well, it's an interesting question, and I haven't discussed with her how she feels at the moment in this evolving cultural environment. You know, she did direct an all-Black or multicultural production of A Streetcar Named Desire. There were thoughts of a new production on Broadway of Having Our Say, but she was not planning to direct that. So I think that's a bit of a nod in the direction that you're implying.
Okay. And there is a question about, what was the solo reading by Gloria Steinem like?
Oh, wow. What a great question. It was sort of awe-inspiring, and yet one could, because she was standing at a podium, and then occasionally she would sit down left, and she read most of the time. She didn't look out at the audience very much. So there was a sense that she was not completely comfortable.
She's kind of shy as a person, actually. She's kind of shy. Sorry? She's kind of shy, Gloria Steinem, as a person.
Well, that's what I've been told, and I don't know the woman.
Let's see, we have another question, and we have about maximum, I'd say, 5 minutes before Tavi cuts us off. But what do you think the future? Do you think there's a future for documentary theater, or is this type of style playwriting falling out of style?
That's also a very intriguing question. I think there definitely is a future for documentary theater. I don't know if we're ever going to go back to the totally rigorous, fact-based theater that some of the German playwrights espoused in the 1950s and early 60s. But I think we are more and more interested in the words and the voices of the people around us and what they think, what they are experiencing, and the political and social context in which they live their lives. And in that respect, I think documentary theater is going to continue to be powerful.
So let's make this maybe the wind-up question, but comparing to other women in theater, some of them who, I'll just read what you said. Some women playwrights, like Wendy Wasserstein, had a lot of connections, and Emily Mann came in with a passion for theater. So how do you think that she was able to do that?
Well, she was talented. She was articulate. She didn't take guff from anybody. She could also be very charming. So perhaps a combination of all of those on a personal level. I submit again, repeating myself, that she was always moving forward. She did not. The book is called Rebel Artist because she just never took no for an answer.
Really?
She, which is not to say she didn't despair at times or she wouldn't be upset, but if very quickly, one of my favorite stories is her encounter in Princeton with what was then a men's club in Princeton. After she became artistic director, she was asked to speak to a group of the club's members. And so she knocked on the door of this club in Princeton, and a gentleman opened the door. And he said, "I'm sorry, but you can't come in the front door. Only the wisest members could come in the front door. You're going to have to go in the back." And she said, "I don't go in the back door." And he said, "Well, you'll have to." And she said, "Well, I'm supposed to talk. And if I don't go in the front door, I'm not going to give my speech." And he said, "Okay." And she went in the front door and gave her speech.
That's a great story and a great metaphor. So we probably need to wrap up. And, I encourage everybody to buy the book. It's like, it was an enjoyable read, and it also gave lots of opportunity to think about and evaluate theater and our role as playwrights. And thank you, so much for joining us. And
thank you for having me.
And it's quite a challenge writing a biography, so I appreciate what you did and went through to get this 300 and 400 pages together. And thank you for really paying attention to women in theater, in a special way.
Same to you, Cindy. You're remarkable in that respect.
International TV. Take it away.
I was just going to say thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your support and your continued support of ICWP and what we do here. And I'm so grateful to Cindy and to Alexis for joining us and speaking about this topic. Thank you all so much. Come check us out. Come check out the book. And thanks again, you guys. All right. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.